let's turn to Romans 14, Feast and Fast and Food, oh my. And tonight's going to be animated, as you can tell, because of where I know I'm going to be going tonight. What I want to do is I just wanted to remind us that we're looking at Romans 14, and we're looking at different bullet points related to the discussions around this chapter. And if you look on my screen right now, I've got these bullets pulled up. And we've been working our way through. I broke this chapter up into all these little bullet points myself. This isn't any particular literary breakdown of the chapter. I just broke these up into the different ways I'm interacting with the topics. We talked about Romans 14:1, where Paul says, "Who are the weak in faith?" And as far as I can ascertain, there's no really agreed upon consensus of who the weak in faith are. There's kind of a predominant perspective that the weak in faith are actually Jewish Christians who are part of the believing community that Paul's writing to, but nevertheless they still have a propensity or a proclivity or a preference or even maybe a superstition about keeping ceremonial and civil parts of the Torah, particularly like Sabbath-related, food-related, kosher issue, that type of stuff. So that their weakness is actually a weakness for not being able to accept the full freedom in Messiah that we have, freedom to break out of the Jewish social norm of keeping Sabbath, to break out of that religious requirement to keep kosher that Moshe handed down. We are free in Messiah. We're free from the law. We're no longer under that. This is the predominant Christian perspective of who the weak and the strong are, even though Paul doesn't say who the strong are, and he doesn't even use the word strong until we get to the next chapter. But that's the implied weak. I think that's not the best way to see the weak. I think the weak are actually somebody else. We've talked about that and we'll continue to talk about that, but I don't want to mention it right now. And then we talked about the contrast between anything and vegetables. It's kind of a dietary issue there, which we're going to get into again when we get a little later on down into the chapter in verses 14 through 18. But verses 2 through 4, the contrast between anything and vegetables. You guys heard me say that I don't think that Paul's trying to uproot Torah, talking about dietary issues there. We're going to revisit that discussion in the next bullet point. In verses 5 through 9, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? We had a kind of a Sabbath versus Sunday discussion. I don't think Paul's trying to say that it's a vote-based decision that we should come to. It is true Christians are free to worship God any day of the week. This is true. But is Paul saying that Sunday trumps Sabbath? I think it's highly unlikely that that's the case, even though that's the popular position. We're really parked out in this verses 10 through 13, who is the brother? And here's where I want to make a confession and ask for your apology as Bible students. I have been really pushing the perspective that I think the brother, the Greek word adelphos or adelphu or adelphon, depending which case you're looking at, I have been really pushing this concept that the brother could include non-Christian Jews within Paul's purview when he's writing the letter, that he's really wanting his small groups to consider that brother could include unbelieving Jews. And I say unbelieving, I mean non-Christian Jews. However, after prayer this week, after careful consideration, after restudying and just go back and looking at the primary sources, that is the text, just doing a word study on my own of the word brother and its different cognates and synonyms found throughout Paul's letter, I'm going to retract that particular line of reasoning because I don't think it's the strongest way to argue what I'm trying to get across. So let me make it plain to those of you who are following this particular study. I don't want you to think of the brother as a non-believing Jew. I want you to think of the brother just the exact same way. Give me a moment here. Exact same way that you've probably already heard it in standard Christian sermons, and you're reading it in your favorite Christian commentary, or you're studying it in seminary. The brother that Paul's writing to are Christians. And so I'm going to stand by that as the primary way of understanding who the brother is. He's absolutely writing to subgroups who are forming around the idea that Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews and of the world, but most importantly for us Gentiles, he's the Messiah that set us free. And he's the one that our groups are meeting for. He's the one. So Paul's writing to Christian groups. And so brother means Christian, brother Christian. I will say this, and we're going to keep working through this angle, that I still believe that these small groups are actually meeting within the larger Jewish communities. I don't want to say that they're meeting in synagogues, but I do believe that they have this awareness of the unbelieving Jewish synagogue that's around them in whatever numbers they still exist after the expulsion by Emperor Claudius. How many Jews remained in Rome, we don't know exactly for sure. There's some debate how many were expelled. I'm of the belief that it wasn't the large number that was expelled. It's actually a more marginal number. But nevertheless, we do know that the groups that are forming could not have formed groups that were completely independent of synagogue affiliation or Jewish affiliation based on Rome's policies of not allowing new religions, at least not until a little later on down the road when the emperors themselves adopted Christianity as a state religion and allowed for Christians to have a little bit more religious freedom. But in Paul's day, when he's writing the letter in the mid-50s, and of course, the expulsion from Rome for the Jews having taken place a little bit earlier than that, most historians put Paul traveling to Rome probably around the 60s, and at least he was under house arrest for about 2 years before something happened. Maybe he was executed, or how things ended for him in Rome. Did he actually even make it to where he was trying to go? But we know he visited Rome finally, but he's writing the letter before he visits. So there's like a 5-year gap is what I'm trying to say. In the mid-50s, he wrote the letter, and then he finally makes it to Rome in the 60s. And how does this impact how many people were there and what their relationship was to the Judaisms that are around them? Those are the things we're trying to ascertain. So the brothers are Christians. They're Christian groups, but I believe they're working as subgroups of Jewish communities that were in existence at the time. In other words, Christianity was still in its infant stage. It didn't enjoy the complete autonomy that it does today as a separate religious group with religious freedoms recognized and allowable by Rome and things like that. So there's some ways that we can understand that they're Christian groups, but they're working with the familiarity of Jewish communities around them, the influence, and in many ways the protection of the Jewish communities and the freedoms that the Jewish communities enjoyed because Rome gave them those freedoms. So that's kind of the angle that we're working from. So I'm happy to admit my error, because I'm like you, I'm a truth seeker. And so I just want to, if I find an angle that I think is not the most helpful, then in my research I want to go back and make those corrections. I'm sorry that I've not seen this angle a little earlier and not expressed it. In my mind, I always knew that the brothers were Christians, but I just wanted to really push the idea that Paul knows that there are unbelieving Jews that are going to be interacting with his readership. To what extent, that's what we're trying to ascertain. And so I was trying to push that angle. I think it's kind of maybe a weaker angle to push. So just consider the brothers as Christians, and we'll be happy from there. But having said all that, let's consider some of the things that help us understand the position that Mark Nanos is trying to get us to appreciate, which is that even though the groups were Christians, and that's who Paul is writing to, these home groups or subgroups were still known and recognized to have had a lot of interaction with the Jewish communities of their time, so much so that some of the language that's used throughout the Bible is indicative of this how should we say, interaction between Jewish groups and Christian groups, and the dynamics of the socio-religious friction that existed between two groups who are claiming some type of legitimacy in the eyes of God. We left off last week with this reading out of Mark Nanos' book, The Mystery of Romans, that I'm borrowing my notes from for this particular discussion. And I'll try to read some of this tonight. I hope to get through most of this. As I mentioned last week, there's a list in chapter 3 where he talks about, and he alerts us to the fact that at times, even though Paul calls the believing group brothers, he's still operating out of this idea that we can have what I think I'm getting this terminology from Mark Nanos, but I can't be certain. I can't remember where I got this. But from Paul's mind, there are brothers according to the flesh, which are natural-born Israelites, right? Fellow Jewish brothers. I would like to refer to those as external brothers from Paul's perspective. External to the Christian faith. They're external in the sense that they've not yet accepted Jesus as this Messianic candidate. Maybe they're open to it. Maybe they're hostile to it. If they're hostile to it, then at some point in time, God's going to have to deal with them. God is going to have to work on them. But if they're open to it, then Paul is going to want to dialogue with them. And we actually find Paul doing that in many, many cases throughout the book of Acts, going directly to the synagogue and holding discussions with these unbelieving Jews in hopes to win them to Christ. Okay, so those would be external brothers. But for Paul, he's a believer. He believes in Jesus. He knows that Yeshua is the Messiah, and he's come to this understanding by the power of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, the groups that he's writing to are Gentile Christians and Messianic Jews, such as himself. And therefore, these brothers to Paul are internal brothers. So for Paul, there are two levels of covenant membership and two levels of brotherhood. There's internal brotherhood and internal or covenant membership or spiritual covenant membership. And then there's limited or external covenant membership and limited and external brotherhood. So that's what we're working from. Let's look at this list that Mark Nanos has listed for us, provided for us in his book. The following list features some of the many examples of Paul's parallel language in Romans when speaking of Christians, whether Jews or Gentiles and non-Christian Jews. You're going to have to go back and look up these references on your own. I don't have time to stop and read all of them, but just this is the list. It's not exhaustive, but this is what's nice is that this is concentrated in Romans. So look at this. On the left side, we have a column labeled Christians, and on the right side, we have a column labeled non-Christian Jews. And notice the similar language that Paul uses throughout his letter to alert us today, we modern readers of the letter, to the fact that Paul had internal and external brothers to deal with. And I believe, like Mark Nanos is trying to alert us to the fact that Paul wanted the internal brothers, the Christian brethren, to be aware of the external brothers that were brothers to Paul, according to the flesh, yes, but also there was this importance that the Christian brothers should consider when they try to ascertain what their position was in salvation history as regards national Israel, unbelieving Israel, the external brothers. Are they to be still be considered important in God's scheme of things? Are they in fact our brothers? I know they're not our brothers according to the flesh. They're not our ethnic brothers, but are they our covenant brothers, albeit somewhat distant because we believe in Jesus and they don't? Can we say that we believe in the same God? Well, yes, we do. Do we hold sacred the same scriptures? Well, yes, we do. What is the social dynamic of this us versus them? How far do we push it? Has God rejected them? Well, Paul says he hasn't. Has God given up on them? Well, Paul says he hasn't. So how do we work this out? And should we even care as Christian brethren? Look at this. The column on the left, as Christians, Paul says that the Christians are brethren. And this is just a few verses. In 1:13 and 8:29, he calls the Christians as brothers. But in chapter 9, verse 3, he calls his external brothers, the Jews, according to the flesh, and he even qualifies it by saying according to the flesh, those are his brethren too. Now, they are to Paul because Paul's a Jew. But the question is, and the challenge, does Paul want his ethnic Jewish brethren, the Christian Gentiles, does he want them to also consider the unbelieving Jews as covenant brothers in some sense? Now, they can't consider themselves as ethnic brothers, but could they be spiritual brothers in some way? I mean, we say they are Israel, they're natural Israel, and we're spiritual Israel. So don't we have a brotherhood in some level there? That's what we're trying to look at. I won't read all the references. I'll just read the labels. Paul uses the phrase adoption as sons, or the concept of being adopted as sons, right? And he refers to Christians in chapter 8 as being adopted as sons. And this is true. Abraham is our father. We'll get to that in a moment as well. So there's this relationship of sonship and fatherhood, using Abraham as our father. And so we are sons, but we're also sons of God. And we'll look at that in a moment. But the non-Christian Jews have always enjoyed that label as adoption as sons. This goes all the way back into the Torah narratives of Exodus and Genesis and things like that. Genesis and Exodus. Israel is God's son, right? And Paul explicitly says so in chapter 9. Christians on the left-hand column are children of God. This is true. All genuine Christians are children of God. But wait a minute, so are the non-Christian Jews. They're also children of God. And Paul was aware of this, and we should be aware of it too. Look at Christians pertaining the glory or the power that God is manifesting to us. We are recipients of this glory. We are witnesses of this glory. In chapter 8, verse 18, Paul talks about that, and he's addressing brother Christians. And yet, non-Christian Jews are also privy to the glory of God as being revealed to them, even though they had eyes but couldn't see. Nevertheless, they were witnesses. It's to their shame that they didn't understand the glory that was being revealed to them. But nevertheless, it was. It's the same glory, the same God. Even Moses even understands that it was messianic, but the children of Israel didn't accept it. Let's keep going. On the left column, as Christians, Abraham is the father of all who share in the same faith that Abraham had. We can read about that way back in Romans chapter 4, where Paul goes to great lengths to explain to Gentiles that you don't need to convert to Judaism or change your status to Israelite, your ethnicity, your affiliation, in order to be counted as the children of God and the children of Abraham. Abraham is your spiritual father. He is the father of all faithful Jews and Gentiles who walk in the footsteps of the faith that Abraham had. I'm paraphrasing some of the terminology that Paul used in Romans there. That's chapter 4. You can also likewise read about this, as I might interject, as we jump books, about the similar quality of Abraham as your father in Galatians chapter 3. Very good parallel passage to Romans chapter 4. I recommend reading those two together in one setting. Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3. Same theological points that Paul's bringing up. But notice, and this is obvious to anyone who reads their Bible, that non-Christian Jews have always recognized Abraham as father, albeit Paul does make a clarification. He says, what do we make of Abraham our father according to the flesh in Romans chapter 4. So it's interesting that he's writing predominantly to believers, but in Romans chapter 4, he turns and directly addresses the Jews of the group because he says, what should we say about Abraham our father according to the flesh? Well, that can only apply directly to ethnic Jews, right? Because Jews, according to the flesh, his brothers, according to the flesh, in Romans chapter 9, corresponds with Abraham our father, according to flesh, in Romans chapter 4. But let's keep going. Christians are the seed of Abraham. If Abraham is your father, and you've been adopted as sons of God, and sons of Abraham, then you are the seed of Abraham. And this corresponds with, of course, the Abrahamic promise and the Abrahamic covenant that God is going to bless Abraham and those who come after him. Not just natural sons, but spiritual sons or covenant sons. We could use that language instead of saying spiritual, if that sounds kind of spooky to you. So Paul addresses Christians, particularly the Gentiles, as the seed of Abraham. But wait a minute. He has always and should recognize that non-Christian Jews, even though they don't believe in Jesus, are in fact seed of Abraham. Although he qualifies that when it comes to election, which we'll look at later on, that just because you are physical seed of Abraham doesn't mean that you are part of the elect and that you will continue into the covenant promises of God. You have to be within the grace of God, and eventually you have to personally accept the Son of God as your very own. But we can still recognize that, historically speaking, that a good number of physical descendants of Abraham should and must be counted as seed of Abraham, albeit from a natural perspective. Christians are beloved of God. Romans chapter 1, verse 7. Non-Christian Jews are beloved of God, contextually. Chapter 11, verse 28. Christians are called. This is a language that Paul uses not just in Romans, but all over his letters. Christians are called. Even here Christians talk about that day. What is your calling? How were you called? But usually, by context, what Paul's referring to when he says called is something related to salvation. That is to say, brought out of of darkness and into redemptive relationship with God through the sacrifice of his son Yeshua. That's what he means by call or calling. Today we don't use it that way as much in Christian circles, but nevertheless, Christians are called. But wait a minute, non-Christian Jews are also called. Yeah, same letter. Christians are the elect. I mentioned this earlier. Christians are the elect of God. God is in control of who he elects, and he doesn't have to answer to anyone for the choices that he makes. In fact, he makes choices within the same family sometimes, right? He elects Abraham to be pulled away from his family clan, and then within Abraham's family and offspring, he elects Isaac instead of Ishmael. And then from Isaac's loins, we got Jacob and Esau, and he elects Jacob instead of Esau, right? Twins from the same mom. And then within the clans of Jacob, the sons of Jacob, he elects certain sons to carry on the preeminent covenantal blessings and such. But the point is, God is the elector. He's the one that elects, and he's the one that chooses who carries on the covenantal promises within any particular generation. And so God elects Gentiles. We know that Gentile Christians are being brought into the family of God as elect of God because the very fact that they have come to accept Messiah is demonstration of the Holy Spirit's work within them. They join the elect as the very people of God. But wait a minute. Non-Christian Jews, generally speaking, from a broad covenantal perspective, Israel is God's elect nation, set apart, holy, elected from all the other nations of the earth. God elected Israel. So this is the paradigm for understanding. We have maybe a smaller context when we're talking about individual Christians as far as these labels, but the broader, larger covenantal community that Paul was already working from and that existed in his day, and indeed does still exist today, are non-Christian Jews, that is to say, covenant Israel, national Israel, unbelieving Israel, right? And then lastly, God foreknew that Gentiles would be brought to the place where they're at as brethren of believing Jews in certain places. But God also foreknew this about non-Christian Jews, about them being in a place where they would be unique to God's salvation program. So Nanos goes on to say that the list could go on to include other clear parallels like those just given, the service in 9:4 and those called to service in 12:1, just as Paul is engaged in service in 1:9, and when speaking of election, us whom he also called not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles in 9:24, and even the continuity of relationship to the law and covenant. Right? Remember in Romans 3, Paul asks a rhetorical question, do we then nullify the law based on the faith that we have? And he answers in the strongest negative that he can using the Greek, me genoita, may it never be. No, and no. We do not nullify Torah based on faith. In fact, one should note that many of the phrases Paul uses in chapter 8 to describe the new status in Christ of those who believe, he turns around and ascribes immediately in chapter 9 to Jews who do not believe in Christ. Certainly no mere coincidence, right? Clearly, Paul would have called Christian Gentiles brethren to non-Christian Jews and vice versa without any further consideration. For the one God of the nations was none other than the one God of historical Israel. So the point that Nanos is trying to bring to our attention is that Paul didn't want the Gentile brothers who were Christians to think of themselves as separated from the people of God that were part of the salvation plan that God was bringing to pass. Here's the way that Israel's place in the world and the Jews' place in the world impacted Paul most significantly, was that Paul realized that God was doing a work in Israel, but he was using the Gentiles to bring Israel to that place of jealousy where they would desire, in a positive way, that which the Gentiles were now exhibiting or displaying, namely this favored relationship with God as their Father, Yeshua as their Messiah, and the Holy Spirit as the one who was empowering them. The Gentiles were doing all of this without having to undergo any change in their ethnic status or social status from Gentile to Jew. And this should bring Israel to a place to wonder. We want what these Gentiles have. They have what we believe the scriptures are foretelling is going to happen in the Achrit Hayamim, the end of days. Right, in the age to come. when most of Israel understood that the nations would be brought into a proper relationship with God and with his Torah. Most Jewish people already believed that this was going to happen someday. What they were challenged was with the idea is that it was actually coming to pass before their very eyes. The future had invaded the present in Paul's mind. The eschaton was on display for us at the in front of our very eyes, although in seminal form, right, as a kind of in earnest. The fullness hadn't come yet, but the fact that these Gentiles were turning from their pagan ways to God, something every religious Jew really actually desired, is something that Paul wanted them to be jealous of, to desire. Hey, don't you want to participate in what God is doing now, not just wait till the end of days to participate in it then? And so the point we're trying to make is that the Jews needed the Gentiles to understand that God was bringing all of Israel to a place where Israel and the nations could worship God together. And we'll see this culminate in Romans chapter 15, where Paul expresses his thoughts using passages at the Tanakh, where he's explaining how Gentiles are praising God in the midst of the people, and the people that are in context are the Jews. But the point I'm trying to bring up for our study tonight is that Paul doesn't want the Gentiles of his reader of this letter to think that they don't need to even concern themselves with the Jewish people. In fact, why would he rebuke them so harshly in chapter 11, or bring up the notions of, if you think that you're boasting against the natural branches, it's not you who's supporting them, they're supporting you. Those types of things. What is that rhetoric even there for? If the Gentile brethren, the Christian brothers in Rome, weren't entertaining this idea that, we're the majority, we're the strong. And I'm going to share with you another resource that I listened to this week, a podcast that has an entirely different take on strong in the week that I'd never considered, but after listening to it, I think has a lot of traction. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let me read one more a paragraph out of Nanos. He's working through these points of considering how our external brothers are the ones that I'm not writing to. I'm speaking as if I'm Paul. I'm not writing to my external brothers, the synagogue communities that are largely comprised of national Israel. But I want you Christian brothers, of who I am writing directly to, the Christians, largely Gentile communities with some Jews scattered here and there amongst them. I want you to be aware of the fact of the unbelieving Jews that you're probably going to encounter here and there. Some of them are probably in our groups, right? Every pastor knows that not everyone in his church, within his church walls, is a believer, and yet he still addresses everybody as, he says, saints, and he stands up in the pulpit on Sunday morning and says, good morning, saints, dearly beloved, good morning, Christians. He knows that not everybody's a Christian. He knows not everybody's a part of the beloved and the saints. But he addresses everybody that collectively. We could use that in Paul as well. I'm sure Paul knows that not everybody who's reading his letter and meeting in these church groups is a true believer, but to the degree that they are professing faith in Messiah as a group, then the word brother applies to them as in the Christian sense of the word. Paul regarded the practices of non-Christian Jews as the result of faith and therefore unquestionably acceptable to God. Remember, he reminds us, he would naturally have urged the same respect from the strong in Rome. Quote, now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. Right? That's where this whole thing got started. Who is the weak in faith? This deep respect runs throughout the entire context of Paul's instruction, not only in chapters 14 and 15, but it is the very point of chapters 9 through 11, which in my opinion is one of the strongest parts of Paul's letter, where we understand this dynamic between believing Jews and unbelieving Jews, believing Christians, believing Gentiles, and perhaps unbelieving Jews. Is in chapters 9 to 11, where he writes, quote, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God. Who is the they? Who is the they? Well, go back and read it for yourself. The they that Paul is referring to are non-Christian Jews who have a zeal for God, which Nanos remarks is often missed in the haste to get to, but not in accordance with knowledge, right? So in chapter 10, Paul speaks of his external brethren, those who have not accepted Jesus as Christ, as having a zeal for God. So you have to stop and ask yourself, is zeal for God good? Yes. Is the zeal for God but not according to knowledge good? Well, probably not. You want to have zeal for God, but you don't want to have zeal for God but not according to knowledge. There's a limit But to the degree that we can describe having a zeal for God and having being in a place where God's words can be heard, God's voice can be heard, God's words are being read and studied, to the degree that we can describe that as a good thing, a measure of grace, so then we would say that having a zeal for God is a positive quality that any particular group should have, especially if we're just comparing it to the exact opposite, right? We can have people who are just absolutely not interested in God. Many secular Jews today, right, are simply not even interested in God. There's no zeal for God at all. Their heart has simply grown cold. And so we would want to express the idea that that's a bad thing. But Paul is saying, I bear them witness. They have a zeal for God, right? This seems to be a positive quality that he's trying to describe about these external brothers. The practice in question are Jewish practices, dietary customs, and calendrical observances that predate the coming of Jesus Christ and that Paul tells the strong to respect because they are done for the Lord and to God and are accepted by the Lord and by God and for those who do them and are the Lord's, verses 3 through 8. Of chapter 14. Nanos goes on to say, interestingly, in the first 8 verses, mention of Christ is completely absent. The focus is on God and on the Lord. Although, equivocally speaking, we could say that the Lord is probably Yeshua in some of those cases, but God is definitely the Father. Paul's not calling Jesus God just yet in this part of his letter. But he perhaps is using the word Lord there in a kind of an equivocation, kind of meaning a slightly ambiguous, could go either way, to refer to either Yeshua, because that word Lord, kurios in the Greek, had already been applied to God the Father in the Old Testament, but now it's being used widely in the New Testament to refer to Jesus. Phrases that are inclusive of non-Christian Jewish faith also. So you have to remember that from a terminology perspective, Paul can use terminology that could apply to non-Christian Jews. And so sometimes we lose sight of that. And then lastly, the last thing I'll read for tonight, let me see how far this goes, is he talks about also there's an implicit recognition that the weak and the strong regard each other as serving different masters in verse 4, that Paul challenges in making his point that they are wrong, right? For both are serving and therefore accepted by the same Lord. And that's a strong sticking point that we also need to walk away with. In the effort to demonstrate that the weak in faith don't have to be Christians, that the weak in faith could in fact be non-Messianic Jews or non-Christian Jews, we have to remember that if these non-Christian Jews are serving their Lord, which is God, and Christians, Gentiles, and Christian Jews are serving their Lord, which is God, well then the commonality is that they're both serving the same Lord, which is God, and they're both accepted by the same Lord, which is God. The difference is that there are times when Paul specifically talks about Christian brothers' devotion to Jesus as their Lord, and of course that's where we're going to make a differentiation from non-Christian Jews. All right, so enough on that particular resource. Let me just make you aware of, let me see if I can find it real quick, and just show you what I listened to this week in closing to this particular part of my study. One of my live internet study, my Skype students who's with me tonight in my study, he alerted me to this resource, and I wanted to share it with those of you who are watching this video as well. Bible Project at BibleProject.com is known for putting together a very interesting set of YouTube videos called the Bible Project. They're not known for their podcasts as much as they are for their YouTube videos, which are a little more well known. But they do have a podcast. And I've got their podcast pulled up right now. They have a study that they're doing 10 episodes called The Family of God. And if you scroll down into that page, you can see that the whole theme that they've been going through is the family of God, God's global family, our collective identity, what's so bad about Babel, Abraham the immigrant and circumcision, sibling rivalry and biblical election, Jesus and the Gentiles, who's in, the powerful and not powerful, one family once more, and then finally coming soon, why do Cain's descendants show up after the flood? And so this is a great Bible study. It's highly recommended, although, as far as I can tell, they don't take a Messianic approach. That is a pro-Torah perspective that teaches, like I do, that the Torah is actually still relevant for Jews and Gentiles in Messiah and should even be followed from a covenantal obligation perspective. I don't think they take that approach. I'm pretty sure they don't. Nevertheless, they have a lot of good things to bring to the discussion that we can all agree on. And one of the things that I really appreciated, so I'm giving kudos to my fellow study buddy in the chat room with me, in the Skype room with me right now, who's listening to my study, He brought this up to my attention. Their study, episode number 8, The Powerful and the Not Powerful, they have a perspective where perhaps when Paul says weak and strong, that the weak are actually Christian Jews who, because of their ethnicity as Jews, were considered not powerful from a social perspective in Rome, owing to the fact that many Jews, we don't know exactly how many, were expelled by Emperor Claudius before Paul wrote this letter. And so from a social perspective, they would have been the marginal ones, the disenfranchised ones, who were kind of working their way back into Rome, but yet had not gained any type of strong social status among the other Romans, whereas the Gentiles, who were not expelled because of their ethnicity, these Gentile Christians would have been in a position where they were the powerful from a social standing. And so Paul wants the Gentiles, who were the predominant readership of his letter, that's not argued, right? I'm not arguing that. But from these Bible Project authors' perspective, the powerful is another way of saying the strong, and the not powerful is another way of saying the weak. And I like that angle. I like that. I think that has some traction. I like that because it alerts the powerful, i.e. the strong, to the fact that Paul doesn't want them to use their position of power to just mow over those in the group who are less powerful, those who are disenfranchised, those who are suffering because of something that was out of their control, perhaps. They all got it, how many Jews got exiled? Again, that's debatable, but the fact that the exile did take place is not debatable. It's history. Even Luke records it in the book of Acts that the Jews were expelled from Rome. How many were expelled? That's, again, open for debate, and we can talk about that a different day. However, the point that they were expelled and that they had to work their way back into Rome as Jews is something that probably didn't escape Paul's readership and didn't escape Paul's authorship. So Paul wants these groups to work with one another because they're both brethren. They're both Christians. Remember, I want you to think of the brothers as Christians, like you probably already did until Ariel tried to challenge you for the last few weeks of thinking of the brothers as not Christian Jews. Shame on you, Ariel. What were you thinking, right? That's not a very good angle. So nevertheless, Paul's writing to Christians, writing to brothers, and he wants the powerful brothers and the not powerful brothers, aka the strong and the weak respectively, to work together with one another and to realize their scope and their position in this big family of God, and to reconcile to one another under the banner of Messiah. We're one family, right? We're diverse, but we're one family. And so I liked that angle. I especially enjoyed it. It's about an hour-long podcast. Give it a listen. Give it a thumbs up. Again, you don't have to be a pro-Torah perspective to appreciate the truths that they're bringing there. And so I like that angle. I like that powerful, not powerful. I've never heard anyone describe this weak and strong that way. I don't agree with every conclusion they come to, but I thought that was one that was worth highlighting. So with that, let's draw our particular Romans 14 study to a close.